Today, there are over 40,000 Chinese restaurants across America. In Guangdong, Cantonese cuisine is all about preserving the natural flavor of the ingredients. But in America, the most popular Chinese dish is orange chicken, deep-fried and smothered in a thick sauce. Yet, both trace their roots to Guangdong. So how did they end up with two completely different flavor profiles? From bean sprouts grown under railroad tracks out of sheer scarcity to chop suey sweeping through the white middle class, and finally, to the iconic takeout boxes printed with red pagodas. Over the past century, what exactly did traditional Cantonese cuisine go through to ultimately weave itself into the very DNA of American society? Today, in New York, Los Angeles, and cities across the globe, many people's first impression of American Chinese food is orange chicken, heavily battered and coated in a thick, sweet orange sauce. Yet, this dish, the best-selling Chinese food in America, cannot be found anywhere on China's traditional culinary map. The defining characteristic of traditional Cantonese cuisine is not about heavy seasoning, but making sure fish tastes like fish and chicken tastes like chicken. Seasoning is merely a supporting character. The ingredient itself is the star. If you love stories about Cantonese food, stick around for this episode. So why did the culinary civilization built around freshness and the natural flavor of ingredients cross the ocean only to transform into something completely opposite and unrecognizable? When the Cantonese wok first arrived in America, the first thing it confronted wasn't the American people, it was the land itself. The bean sprouts and broccoli in today's American Chinese food are the lasting marks of that first adaptation. And it all traces back to a historic upheaval in the mid-19th century that fundamentally altered the fate of Guangdong. In the late 18th century, the Qing dynasty strictly restricted foreign trade. Merchant ships from Europe and America could almost exclusively trade in Guangzhou, sustaining countless porters, sailors, and dock workers. However, in 1840, the gunboats of the British Empire forced open the gates of the Qing Empire. 2 years later, the Qing government was defeated. Hong Kong was ceded, and 5 ports, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen, were forced to open. Guangzhou lost its status as the sole trading port, and countless people who depended on it lost their livelihoods overnight. Following the defeat in the Opium War, the Qing government passed the financial burden of massive reparations down to the lowest classes. Under the crushing weight of taxes, Guangdong was hit by consecutive floods and locust plagues, but leaving the already strained farmland completely barren. Meanwhile, the population continued to grow, making land and water resources scarcer by the day. In 1849, the California gold rush erupted. People in Guangdong called San Francisco Gold Mountain, fueled by legends of gold covering the ground. The rumors quickly spread back home, and going to America became their only chance to start over. Some sold everything they owned. Others signed labor contracts and boarded ships bound for America. They brought very little with them, but that cast iron wok became one of the few essential tools packed again and again. In the mid-1850s, fighting over limited arable land, local Cantonese residents and Hakka immigrants erupted into over a decade of bloody clan wars. War and famine forced more of the lower class to leave everything behind and continue crossing the Pacific. But upon arriving in San Francisco, reality quickly shattered their illusions. Easily accessible gold was soon depleted, and the anti-Chinese policies, along with the foreign miners' tax, grew increasingly oppressive. At the same time, railroad companies began massive recruitment of Chinese laborers to survive. Chinese workers were forced to shift from gold mining to grueling manual labor. In the 1860s, construction of the Transcontinental Railroad began on a massive scale. Thousands of Chinese laborers were sent to the desolate western mountains and the snow-covered peaks of Nevada. The construction sites were far from cities, making vegetables incredibly scarce, so Chinese workers started cultivating bean sprouts from mung beans. Meanwhile, they held onto their habits from back home, thoroughly boiling their water and drinking tea. After the railroad was completed, a large number of Chinese workers dispersed across America. To make a living, they turned to what they knew best: opening laundromats and Chinese restaurants. In the American heartland, far from California's farms, gailan, Chinese broccoli, essential to traditional Cantonese dishes, was impossible to source reliably. By the mid-20th century, with the maturation of American commercial agriculture, Western broccoli, available year-round, gradually replaced the elusive gailan and became permanently embedded in the DNA of American Chinese food. From that handful of bean sprouts along the railroad tracks to the ubiquitous beef and broccoli across the country, the Cantonese wok had learned to adapt to American soil. But the real challenge would soon appear on the other side of the dining table. The challenge of adapting to the land had been solved, but a new conflict emerged on the dinner plate. Shortly after the railroad's completion, America plunged into a prolonged economic depression. Unemployment soared, and the Chinese instantly became scapegoats for stolen jobs. In 1882, the United States formally passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the first time in American history and the only time an immigration law specifically targeted a single ethnic group. More and more industries shut their doors to the Chinese. Opening restaurants became one of the few ways left to survive. Traditional Cantonese cuisine emphasizes serving whole chickens and fish with bones intact, believing this preserves the truest flavor of the ingredient while representing the tradition of completeness at the table. But this directly clashed with the eating habits of Western consumers. To cater to Westerners who used forks and knives and weren't used to spitting out the bones, Cantonese chefs removed chicken heads, fish bones, and organs. Boneless chunks of meat became one of the foundational principles of American Chinese food. But what truly determined whether a restaurant would survive was the price. Eating habits could be changed, but if it couldn't turn a profit, a restaurant still wouldn't survive. What truly transformed the destiny of American Chinese food was a dish that would later take America by storm: chop suey. Chop suey wasn't a decline in culinary skill. It was a brilliant and highly efficient business model. Under exclusion policies and the social discrimination, many Chinese could only cluster in Chinatowns. These neighborhoods protected them but also confined them. In the late 19th century, Chinese restaurants cornered in the isolated Chinatowns faced brutal competition. To survive and to attract white customers, Chinese restaurants had to pursue a path of extreme cost efficiency. Adapting to local conditions, they chose cheap, readily available celery, onions, and easily grown bean sprouts as main ingredients, throwing in a bit of shredded meat and using the cheapest vegetables to maximize the portion size. The Cantonese chefs turned to one of the defining techniques of Chinese cooking: thickening with starch. The light glaze characteristic of traditional Cantonese food was progressively magnified in American Chinese cooking. Chefs began using heavy amounts of cornstarch, combining it with soy sauce, sugar, and broth to create a dark, intensely thick, glossy sauce, coating the dish right before it left the blazing wok. At the time, Western diners generally couldn't stomach the pungent black bean or salted fish flavors of traditional Chinese food, but this thick starch-based sauce proved more appealing to American tastes. Coupled with dirt cheap prices and massive portions, This quick, affordable dish swept through white, middle-class, and blue-collar communities in San Francisco and New York over the decades, becoming America's trendiest late-night dining destination. Cantonese chefs had finally found a way to make money, but the American industry would soon take this formula and scale it up into an entirely new flavor. Just as Cantonese chefs learned how to profit, American industry stepped in to redefine what people consider delicious. From this moment on, American Chinese food truly transformed into the familiar shape we know today. Between the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, the Second Industrial Revolution propelled America into a hyper-industrialized era. Densely packed factories and a non-stop stream of industrial workers emerged in major cities, making high-calorie foods increasingly popular among workers and the general public. At the same time, America's industrial sugar refining and massive oil processing industries matured. Refined sugar, processed vegetable oil, and white flour became the cheapest, most reliably supplied high-energy raw materials in the American industrial system. Chinese restaurant owners began asking a different question. What kind of dish is the easiest to sell, the easiest to replicate, the easiest to standardize? They took the sweet, sour, and deep-fried logic, which held a marginal status in traditional Cantonese cuisine, and scaled it up for mass production. Chefs battered meat heavily and deep-fried it to a crisp, allowing it to absorb more oil before drenching it in massive amounts of white sugar, vinegar, and concentrated fruit juices. In Guangzhou, chefs pursued the pure essence of ingredients. In America, sweet, sour, and deep-fried took center stage. This hyper-sweet, heavy-fried trajectory crystallized completely in the post-war fast food franchise era at an incredibly low cost. It created high salt, high sugar, high fat calorie bombs. Yeah, the familiar orange chicken wasn't on the menu just yet. It wasn't until fast food chains boomed after World War II and sweet and sour fried variations evolved that Panda Express introduced the now iconic orange chicken in 1987. By this point, the Cantonese wok had fully adapted to the American palate. The flavors had changed, but what came out of the wok had not yet truly become American food. What finalized this transformation wasn't the kitchen, but American society itself. This process began in the early 20th century in New York's Lower East Side. At the same time, Jewish immigrants, another marginalized group, lived side by side with the Chinese. When the Cantonese tried to step out of Chinatown to attract these neighboring customers, they hit a seemingly insurmountable wall: strict Jewish dietary laws, kosher. One of the ultimate taboos in kosher law is mixing meat and dairy, yet traditional American burgers, pizza, and Western meals were dripping with cheese and butter. But traditional Cantonese cooking used neither milk nor butter. While it didn't strictly meet kosher standards compared to dairy-heavy Western food, Chinese food was far more approachable for many secular Jewish consumers. Even more subtly, although kosher law strictly forbids pork and shellfish, the Chinese practice of dicing, mincing, and masking ingredients in heavy sauces actually reduced the psychological discomfort associated with these forbidden foods. In an era of widespread xenophobia, Chinatown became one of the few places where Jewish people felt relatively at ease. This cultural embrace, combined with the fact that Chinese restaurants stayed open on Christmas Day, eventually birthed the uniquely American tradition of eating Chinese food on Christmas. After World War II, the American middle class began migrating en masse to the suburbs. The era of cars and televisions had arrived. More and more families moved into suburbs far from city centers. Cars expanded people's daily radius, and bringing dinner home became a new way of life. This work was no longer content staying confined to Chinatowns and urban cores. It had to adapt to modern American life. Chinese restaurants began widely adopting a paper pail originally used for holding oysters, and in the 1970s, printed it with the iconic red pagoda. This heat-retaining, leak-proof box that unfolded right into a plate perfectly matched the post-war American lifestyle of eating takeout. It completely shattered the borders of Chinatown, and alongside the Jewish Christmas tradition, delivered Chinese food into millions of American homes. Ultimately, American Chinese food was no longer simply an immigrant cuisine brought from China. It had evolved into America's own regional cuisine. Looking back, today's American Chinese food is no longer merely a regional Chinese cuisine, nor is it a copy of Cantonese food, and certainly not a betrayal of tradition. It is a long-term mutual adaptation forged by the Cantonese wok and American society. As that century-old Cantonese cast-iron wok heats up once again, sauces bubble, and the sweet and tangy aroma fills the air. If you're feeling hungry right now, go grab a plate of freshly tossed, sauce-glazed orange chicken. Because every bite carries the marks left by more than a century of adaptation.